What happens when the land you own starts owning you? For generations, farmers believed soil was the one thing that could never betray them. Land wasn't a stock you could lose overnight. It wasn't paper wealth. It was something you could touch, dig your hands into, and pass down to your children. In a world of speculation and risk, land was fight solid, sacred, and certain. They called it the golden age of farming, when every sunrise felt like a promise written in wheat. But in the years leading up to 1929, that faith turned into a financial trap. When wheat prices soared during the First World War, farmers took it as a sign of destiny. Banks offered easy loans, and land prices rose alongside hope. Owning more acres meant earning more dollars. It felt like a simple equation until it wasn't. Because underneath that fertile soil, another seed had been planted, the seed of debt. Every new acre meant a new loan. Every harvest meant more output, but less profit. And yet the logic was intoxicating. If prices fall, who's grow more? It sounded rational, until it became ruinous. By 1929, many American farmers weren't just tilling soil, they were digging their own financial graves. The market crash didn't just hit Wall Street, it hit the wheat fields of Kansas, the cotton farms of Oklahoma, and the corn belts of Iowa. When prices collapsed by half, the debt didn't. The land that once symbolized freedom now represented a lifetime of bondage. And here, the part no one saw coming. You can't sell what everyone is trying to sell. Across the Midwest, auctions became funerals. Entire generations watched their family lands sold to banks for pennies. The same land that had fed millions now couldn't feed its own owners. They had invested in something they thought could never fail. And in doing so, they revealed a truth that haunts investors to this day. The safest investment isn't what you own. It's what you'll understand. Before the crash, there was confidence, the kind that makes you believe tomorrow could never betray today. During the Roaring '20s, the American farmer wasn't a victim. He was a believer. The world had just emerged from the Great War. Europe's fields lay in ruins, its people starving, its markets desperate, and the American farmer became the world's supplier, feeding nations and fueling the illusion that prosperity was permanent. Wheat, corn, and cotton prices tripled. New tractors roared across the plains like engines of destiny. Banks lined up to offer loans. Land agents whispered, "Buy now or regret later." And for the first time, the farmer felt like a businessman, an investor, not a laborer. He borrowed not to survive, but to expand. Every acre bought on credit felt like a future victory. But here's the cruel symmetry of every boom. The same optimism that builds wealth also blinds you to its limits. The more farmers earned, the more they planted. The more they planted, the lower prices slipped. And yet, each drop in price only fueled more production. A paradox of desperation disguised as ambition. The logic was simple. Sell more to make up for earning less. But simple logic has destroyed more fortunes than greed ever did. By 1928, the heartland still looked prosperous from a distance. New tractors, bigger barns, endless fields. But beneath that shine lay mortgages, loans, and silent anxiety. Many farmers owed more to the bank than their land could ever repay. Te wustidente know it yet. In small towns across Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, people still gathered on Sundays to talk about the good years. They believed they were living through a new golden age, one where land was the safest treasure on earth. After all, how could food ever go out of fashion? But that's the danger of stability. It teaches you to forget risk. And when you forget risk, you start borrowing against dreams instead of profits. When the crash came in 1929, farmers didn't fall right away. They just stopped rising. And that's how most collapses begin. Not with thunder, but with silence. The soil still looked rich. The barns still stood tall. But quietly, debt had already planted its roots deeper than any seed ever could. Every bubble begins with belief and ends with disbelief. For the American farmer, disbelief arrived in silence. The markets that once roared with the price of wheat and cotton now whispered numbers no one wanted to hear. A bushel of wheat that once sold for $2 was now worth barely $1. then 50 cents. Half the price, half the income. But the debt never halved. Banks didn't care what the harvest brought, only what the contract demanded. And so, balance sheets that once looked manageable turned monstrous overnight. To make up the loss, farmers did what they always did. They worked harder. They planted more. They tilled more acres. They doubled production, hoping to balance the books. But every extra harvest only deepened the wound. Every bushel added to the flood. The market was drowning in abundance, and yet no one could afford to eat. This was the moment when logic betrayed them. The soil that once promised safety now mocked them, producing plenty but yielding nothing. And then came the drought. The sun stopped forgiving. The winds grew cruel. Crops withered before they ripened. The land cracked like an old promise. What began as bad weather became a biblical punishment. The Dust Bowl wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a financial execution. Banks foreclosed on fields that couldn't even feed a family. Farm auctions became a ritual of humiliation. Families standing on their porches, watching strangers bid on their barns, their tools, their futures. Sometimes neighbors came not to buy, but to silently pray their names wouldn't be next. In those moments, a farmer's face could tell the story of a nation. Pride turned into debt. Labor turned into loss. And the land, the sacred, untouchable land, had turned against its owners. But here's what history forgets. The Great Depression didn't just destroy wealth. It destroyed faith. Faith in fairness. Faith in hard work. Faith in the quiet promise that if you did everything right, life would repay you in kind. Because when markets collapse, numbers aren't the only thing that fall. People do too. It's one thing to lose money. It's another to lose meaning. By the early 1930s, the American farmer wasn't just broke. He was broken. The land that once stood as a symbol of pride had become a graveyard of promises. Each morning began the same way. Dust in the air, silence in the fields, and a stack of unpaid bills waiting on the kitchen table. But the hardest thing wasn't the hunger. It was the helplessness. For generations, farmers had believed one unshakable truth. If you work hard enough, the land will provide. But now, no matter how early they rose, how deep they dug, nothing grew except debt. Hard work had lost its power. And when hard work stops working, something inside a man starts to die. Foreclosure notices arrived like clockwork. Men who'd spent their lives paying off 1 acre at a time watched entire farms sold at auction in minutes. The same barns they built with their hands were bought by banks they could never hope to repay. And then came the humiliation, the kind that doesn't make headlines, but stays in the soul. Proud families moving in with relatives. Fathers selling their last horse for half its worth. Mothers cooking without flour. Sons leaving home to search for work that didn't exist. Some farmers stopped attending the auctions altogether. They couldn't bear to watch strangers trample the soil where their fathers were buried. Others stood silently, hats in hand, as if mourning a death that hadn't yet been announced. They weren't just losing land. They were losing legacy. And here lies the cruelest irony. These were the men who had fed the nation. The same hands that built America's abundance were now reaching out for government relief. Pride turned into paperwork. Strength turned into silence. Across the Dust Bowl, the wind became the only sound that never stopped, a hollow echo where harvest songs once lived. And for Mani, that silence said everything. The land was ours. Until it wasn't. The dream was real. Until it ended. That was the true cost of the crash, not the fall of the dollar, but the fall of faith. When the dust finally settled over the American plains, it didn't just cover the soil. It buried an entire way of life. What vanished in those years wasn't just wealth. It was certainty. For generations, farmers had believed the oldest promise on earth, that land could never fail, that as long as you could plant, you could survive. But 1929 taught a crueler truth. Nothing is immune when confidence collapses. Not stocks. Not property. Not even the ground beneath your feet. It's strange how history repeats, always in different clothes. Back then, it was wheat and cotton. Today, it's real estate, crypto, or gold. Different names, same psychology. The same blind faith that what's tangible must be safe, that what's real can't vanish. But it always can, because risk doesn't live in assets. It lives in assumptions. The farmer's tragedy wasn't greed, it was belief. Belief that more land meant more safety, that harder work could outpace falling prices. That debt was a bridge, not a trap. But debt doesn't care about effort. It only cares about math. And math, when ignored, always wins. When the crops died and the banks came, many farmers swore they'd never borrow again. Yet their children grew up chasing new dreams, new markets, new highs, because every generation convinces itself that this time it's different. But it never is. Because the soil may change, the assets may change, but human nature doesn't. We still mistake ownership for security. We still think hard work can outpace hard numbers, and we still call something safe right before it collapses. In the end, the Great Depression didn't just reshape the economy. It redefined safety itself. For the farmer, safety was no longer the land. It was the lesson that real wealth isn't in what you own. It's in what you understand, what you control, and what you can survive losing. The land turned against them once, but the lesson it left behind still whispers through time. Never confuse ownership with immunity.